Now, let us go to Delphi. Let us go back to the past. And the best person to make that journey with us is the historian, professor at Warwick University, Michael Scott. Michael Scott has written a book that came out, I think, in 2015. It inspired us very much because it happened just at the time where we were thinking about going to Delphi to start the World Human Forum Initiative. And Michael Scott, in his book, tells us the whole history of Delphi. But today, he's going to travel with us back to the time as it was. And we are going to follow him. And after that, we will ask ourselves the one question that each of us might want to ask the oracle if we could really travel back in time. But that will come after Michael Scott.
Alexandra, thank you so much. And it's a great pleasure to be with you all today to share a little of this wondrous ancient. I want you all to close your eyes, to take this as your imaginations away from wherever you find yourselves in the world right now to ancient Delphi, and to imagine a little bit what it was like in its heyday 2,500 years ago, when people came from all over the ancient world to consult its famous oracle, a female priestess, the Pythian priestess, who was there to offer guidance to those who came. You had to journey far, and even when you arrived close to Delphi, there was still a great climb ahead of you. Delphi, the city and the sanctuary, sit nestled in the Parnassian mountains, some 600 meters above sea level. If you arrive by land or if you arrive by sea, you stare up the mountainside, craning your neck to try to get some glimpse of this great place, resplendent in shining ivory, bronze, gold, silver, and marble, hidden away in the crests and nestles of the Parnassian mountains. As you make your way slowly up the mountainside, Delphi would have come into view. You would have started to see a little bit of the glory that was the sanctuary of the god Apollo, and at its heart, the temple of Apollo, whose remaining columns you can still see standing proud in this image in front of you, in which the Pythian priestess was waiting for your questions. This was a place of special meaning. Delphi was not hidden in the Parnassian mountains just because. It was there because it was at the center of the world. The ancient writer Strabo had famously told a story that the king of the gods, Zeus himself, had let loose two eagles from opposite ends of the earth, and where they had met, the center of the world, that place was Delphi. As you journeyed up through the mountainside in the gathering dusk at the end of a long journey, you were coming to the very center of the world. But you were not going to be alone. In fact, you would meet many people as you marched up the mountainside to Delphi, because you could not just turn up on any day you felt like it to ask your question of the Pythian priestess. In fact, there were only very few, very special days that you could come. One day every month for 9 months of the year. You, as a result, if you imagine yourselves, you would have been preparing for this day for quite some time. You would have been planning your journey to ensure that you could get to Delphi, to the center of the world, for the day. Otherwise, it would be missed and you would be waiting for an entire month or potentially 4 months for the next opportunity. As you arrived, people would be joining you from all over the ancient world, each with their own question to ask the Pythian priestess. As you emerged into the crest of the Parnassian mountains, where the sanctuary of Apollo and the Pythian priestess was, you would be greeted by a small city surrounding the sanctuary, home to perhaps no more than 1,000 citizens, the citizens of Delphi, whose job it was to house and guard and run the sanctuary. And it was here, nestled in amongst these houses, camped on the mountain sides, accompanied by 1,000 fires that night, you would probably spend the night waiting for the next day, for the great opportunity to ask your question of the Pythian priestess. Imagine the noise as darkness fell, the flickering firelights of perhaps thousands, tens of thousands of people all gathered, hoping to have their chance to ask the Pythian priestess, and thus the gods, their question. There was something special and magical, mystical in the air then, as there is now. If anyone goes to Delphi, whether they know lots about it or nothing about it, they always feel that Delphi is special. When the sun rose on the Parnassian mountains the next day, you might be gathering to watch the Pythian priestess herself emerge from her home to take a ritual bath in the springs that run through Delphi to prepare herself for her day of consultation. You would gather nervously to see whether the final checks performed by the priests would allow the consultation to go forward. They sprinkled drops of cold water on a goat to see whether the goat would shiver, and that shiver was taken as a sign that the god Apollo was waiting and willing to hear through the Pythian priestess your questions. How did you decide on which order to line up in? There would be thousands of you. Who went in first? There was a very, very specific lineup order. The local Delphians always were at the head of the queue. Then any citizen coming from a city that had a representative on something called the Amphictyonic Council. Delphi, the sanctuary, was run by the citizens of Delphi, but it also answered to a large representative council with city-states from all across Greece. It was, as many have argued, a kind of prototype EU or UN who kept an eye on this so important a sanctuary. So if you came from one of the city-states who were on that council, you then got to line up second. Then if you were Greek, you got to line up next. And then anyone from outside the Greek world came next. Some very, very special individuals, some very, very, very important cities who had helped Delphi in the past, had what was known as promanteia, the right to skip the queue and to consult the oracle first ahead of everyone else. You would be lining up as we go in closer here to the sanctuary of Apollo and we see the temple of Apollo resplendent at the center. You would be lining up a zigzag line of consultants going through the sanctuary and probably outside of it as you waited your turn to ask the Pythian. You would be talking to one another around you. What are you going to ask? Have you been here before? What's it like when you get inside the temple in front of the Pythian priestess? What is it like to ask that question? What is it like to hear the answer? And as you waited patiently, as the sun rose across the city and sanctuary of Delphi, you would be looking around you, as you can see in this image, at all the resplendent buildings that were shining in marble, bronze, silver, gold, not just buildings, but statues, statue groups, precious items. And of course, you would also be passing the Omphalos itself, that which represented the very center of the world at Delphi. These buildings are not there by any accident. As you moved past them waiting to ask your question, you would be able to read who had dedicated them. It would be the different cities of ancient Greece and indeed of further afield across the Mediterranean. They would have been gifted to Apollo, to the sanctuary of Delphi, by city-states over the past hundreds of years in grateful thanks for the aid that the oracle had given them, and which aid you too hoped to be soon to receive. As you moved past not just the small buildings and treasuries, but the dedications by individuals, you would start to see things that perhaps replicated your own intentions if you too got good advice from the oracle. Individual statues, smaller, precious heirlooms that had been left by individuals who couldn't afford to build a building or have a statue in bronze, but could afford to give something that was special to them in thanks to the god. Once it had been dedicated within the sanctuary of Apollo, it was the property of the god forevermore and could never, ever be taken away. You would also pass the monuments to the great moments in Greek history. We are this year celebrating the 2,500th anniversary of the Battle of Salamis, that great sea victory of the Greeks against the Persians. It was commemorated at Delphi, right in front of the Temple of Apollo, with a large statue of Apollo holding in his hand one of the trireme warships that had helped the Greeks be victorious. You would see inscriptions, texts written by thousands of individual Delphians who had come just as you had over the 1,000 years that people came to consult the Pythian priestess, talking about their questions, their responses, and their outcomes. You would see monuments to athletic glory, because as you can see from the picture, Delphi had also a stadium, a running track, and hosted great athletic and musical competitions just as good as the ancient Olympics at Olympia. You would hear stories of how wars had been declared. Wars had been fought over Delphi, over ownership of Delphi, over to ensure that it remained open and available to all from whoever and wherever they came. You would hear about how Delphi itself had been threatened on occasion, and the gods themselves had come in to fight to save Delphi and make it safe once again. And you would also see philosophers, those who gathered at Delphi to drink in this special, magical, mystical place and to think and reflect on the great wisdoms of humanity. Inscribed around the sanctuary would be some of those great maxims that had come to life. One of my favorites, Meden Agan, nothing in excess, was one of the mottos of Delphi. People traveled from far and wide to record these philosophical ideals and take them home. Today, in modern-day Afghanistan, there is the ancient settlement of Iconium. And in Iconium was excavated a statue and an inscription that was set up in the 3rd century BCE by a man called Clearchus, who had traveled from ancient Iconium, which is in modern-day Afghanistan, all the way to Delphi to record those great philosophical maxims and ideas, and then return to his home to have some of them inscribed so that his local neighbors and inhabitants could benefit from them also. And this is the one that we have found today at the site of Iconium. As children, learn good manners. As young men, learn to control the passions. In middle age, be just. In old age, give good advice. Then die without regret. You have finally made it to the front of the temple of Apollo. It is finally your turn to ask your question of the oracle. How do you do it? Delphi required you to put your question in a very specific form. You had to say, would it be better if I did X or Y? You had to offer two options to the Pythia. You go inside the temple into the cool darkness, having been out in the baking sun of the day, and you make your way towards where the Pythia sits. What happens next is shrouded in mystery even today. We do not have a single source that tells us exactly how you met the Pythian priestess inside the Temple of Apollo. It is a secret that went to the grave of the last Pythian priestess when Delphi finally fell silent in the 4th centuries CE. But we do know some of the responses that she gave, because those responses were not a yes or a no, do X or Y. They were very often complex riddles, things not easily and quickly understandable. When the Athenians as a group went to consult the oracle at Delphi, as the Persians were invading in the 480s BCE, and they were considering how best to stand up against the Persian invasion, the response they got from the Pythian priestess was to trust in their wooden walls. We hear from the ancient sources that they went back home scratching their heads, wondering what did that mean? How do we understand the advice of the Pythia? Or King Croesus of Lydia, when he asked whether he should invade a neighboring empire, got told this: if you attack, a great empire will fall. But whose? The art of Delphi, the art of the oracle, was not giving you a straight answer. It was, in the ancient Greek, semaine, indicating what needed to be considered. It demanded of the consultants that you went away and thought about the response and then decided for yourselves what to do. Delphi was not some kind of answer giver, but an aid, a sense-making mechanism to enable and empower you to find your own answer. Or as some have remarked to me in the past, Delphi acted a little like a management consultant. And so I put this question to you, and we're going to be coming back to this in the breakout sessions. If you had the chance to ask the Pythia one question, what would it be? What would be your question that you put to the Pythian priestess? Jochen has already mentioned that above the entrance to the Temple of Apollo was another of the great maxims of Delphi. Know thyself, know thyself. That is what Delphi wanted you to think about as much as it wanted you to think about the answer it gave to the question you put. The Pythian priestess answered questions for 1,000 years in antiquity, only falling silent in the 4th centuries CE. And then Delphi herself, as a sanctuary and as a city, slowly was lost from human memory. It completely disappeared, indeed, underneath a much smaller, less impressive modern village that grew up on top of it, not realizing that it stood on top of ancient Delphi. But the central message of Delphi has never been forgotten. Know thyself, nor the need that it focused on for discussion, debate, and understanding by individuals themselves, between individuals within small groups, and by larger communities in order to make the best decisions. This was not an ask your question and answer place. This was an ask your question and then reflect, discuss, debate, and come to your own decision. Delphi in the 20th century has emerged once again from the ground. Here we see the original excavation and the unveiling of one of its most famous statues, the statue of Antinous, as a symbol for the humanity that was at the very heart of what Delphi was. Now resplendent once again in the Greek sunshine, gleaming in its marble bronze, it forces us once again to consider the importance of having a place where individuals and communities could confront their difficulties and consider their responses. In 1987, it was made a UNESCO World Heritage Site exactly because it was an example for all humanity of a time and a place where people could come together to tackle their problems, governed by, as we've said, this group, this amphictyony, some kind of prototype EU or UN. Today, Delphi sits at the center of a number of EU walking paths. It's home to the EU Cultural Centre, and it's an emblem for the ongoing need for humanity to come together, know itself, and come up with itself the answers to its problems. The World Human Forum, launched at Delphi, as we've been hearing, is helping to bring this ancient power of Delphi alive again, encouraging people from all over the world to discuss, exchange ideas, and create networks. And this meeting today, across the world, virtually, as an echo of Delphi, between Delphi and Ludwigsburg, I think brings the ancient message of Delphi back to the future. Know thyself, because we have in us, together, the consciousness to connect, change, and create. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. I think after listening to you, almost everybody will understand that there couldn't be a better place to start the World Human Forum initiative than Delphi.